Sometimes we feel so distant from the New Testament. I mean, we are so familiar with the lessons that are there that we have a connection. But when you sit back and you look at them and you go, I don't know. It is so much different than the way things are today. But there are times and there are stories in the New Testament that could have happened yesterday just as much as they happened 2,000 years ago. And this morning I want to take a look at one that comes from Acts chapter 17. And I believe that the story of Paul preaching in Athens could have occurred in Washington, D.C., or in Pierre, or wherever last week. The names may have changed, and some of the concepts, or maybe some of the particulars, would have been different, but a lot of the concepts are the same. This morning we want to take a look at Paul's sermon in Athens. And we want to do a couple of things. First of all, very quickly, we're going to take a look at the sermon. But I want to spend most of the time this morning talking about the applications and really how this lesson teaches us about how to teach in today's world. Let's go backwards just a little bit, and I appreciate the passage that was read. I couldn't have thrown enough more Greek words in there than what I did. Stoicism and Areopagus and all that. So you guys did a great job, and makes me feel better when I mispronounce them here in a minute. But they read just the introduction to the story. Paul comes into Athens. He is on one of his missionary journeys into the great, it is actually the great region of the time. Folks, it may have been the Roman world, but it was the Greek influence. The Greeks were the ones who held the language. They were the ones who were the cutting edge of philosophy and of logic. And when Paul walks into Athens, you can see this issue that's going on in his mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But he is compelled to go and to preach Jesus to these people. And in the beginning, he goes to the synagogue and he preaches there for a little bit, and then he starts to go into the courtyard where the Stoics and the philosophers and others would gather, and they would discuss these great concepts, and they loved to get together and talk religion and talk philosophy. But at one point, he gets up and he is given the attention, and he delivers what is the sermon on Mars Hill. I want to read, beginning in verse 22, read down through verse 34 of Acts chapter 17. Luke tells us, "So Paul stood up in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I found an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and their boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think of the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. When Paul gets the opportunity to preach, and when he gets the floor, he delivers to these philosophers a very wonderful illustration of the beginning and the presence of God. Paul's lesson is pretty simple by today's standards. He introduces these folks to this concept of God. He tries to introduce them to this idea of a God that they did not know. This was a very religious community, but they were void of Jehovah God. As Paul stands up, he looks around, and he begins his lesson by saying, I can see that you are very religious. Just look at all of the gods that you have altars to. But I want to talk to you about one, about this one that's represented by this altar that says to an unknown God. Let me talk to you about this God that you don't know yet. And from there, he began to preach Jesus to them. Paul contrasts Jehovah God from all of the other gods that are there. He talks about the fact that this God who lives in heaven but who walks among them is not a God that needs anything from mankind. He's not a God that has an altar that's made out of him. He's not a God that has an image that's been created in the hearts and the minds of mankind. He's not a God that needs to be washed and repainted all the time, because God is not a physical image. He's the God who created everything. He's the one who actually, in contrast to man taking care of him, he takes care of mankind. He's a God who created everyone, but also wants everyone to be saved. Wonderful, wonderful lesson about how this Jehovah God transcends all the other gods in a city full of idols. This lesson is an interesting lesson in and of itself, and if I had a couple of hours, we'd take a look at, and no, I'm not going to preach for a couple of hours, it's an hour and a half. If we had more time, we would take a look at this lesson. But what I want to do is, I want to take Paul's concept of how he preaches in Athens and see if we can make an application to today's world. We live in a world that is remarkably similar to the one in which Paul lived. You see, we live in a world that is sophisticated and educated, a world that is filled with religion, but also a world that is missing God. You can't turn around in today's world without finding some type of religious example. And I'm going to tell you, folks, in our world, our nation has become so much smaller than it once was. We're going to be introduced even to more religions that are going to come in. So we're going to see the need to be purveyors of God in a pagan world. How do we go about doing that? I think there are three lessons that we can learn about Paul's teaching, or from Paul's teaching in Athens. The first one is that to teach in today's world, we need to apply love and logic. When you look at the introduction of this section, Luke tells us that Paul, when he got to Athens, was being provoked in spirit. I'm not exactly sure that this means that it ticked him off. Maybe it does. But I think what it means is Paul walks into this community and he is moved by the fact that they are so religious, but they are missing Jehovah God. There was an emotion inside him as he looked around and saw all the idols. But interestingly, he doesn't just rely on that emotion. What he does is he applies reason. He knew that he was in the seat of logic. He was in a place where rational thought and discussion was important. He couldn't go in and just rely upon just raw emotion to change the community. It was going to take him having to formulate thought and reason and logic and present his message in a way in which they would accept it. He may have been compelled in his heart to teach, but he relied upon his head to lead that discussion. You know, as we look around our world today, it is easy to be heartbroken. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. And quite frankly, a lot of it is done in the name of religion. And it can tear us up. When we look at what religion has done to our nation and to our world. And we can be compelled by this emotion to go out and to try to make a difference. But what happens if we in today's society are led purely by emotion, purely by passion? We're not going to get very far. So what we have to do, if we truly want to teach in today's world, we have to apply reason. People today want to be swayed by reason. It's not enough just to try to compel them with the emotion of God, with the emotion of religion. They need reason. They need to have someone explain to them why religion should be an important part of their lives. I work a lot with young people. Most of the guys that I work with are 21 to 25 years old. And let me tell you something that does not go well in today's society. It's the phrase, "I told you so." Because I said so. Maybe generations ago, we were religious and we believed in a doctrine because that's what we were taught. But in today's world, that doesn't play. People today need to find things personal and practical. They need reason. They need logic. People today are going to ask, show me why what my family has believed for generations isn't good enough for me. Prove to me that what my family taught back in the old country, back in the Middle East or in Northern Europe or even in our community here, convince me that that's not good enough for me. It was good enough for them. Why isn't it good enough for me? Prove to me that this God, and quite frankly, this God whose reputation has been pretty perverted over the last few decades. Prove to me why this God is applicable in today's sophisticated world. It seems like he's pretty archaic. People need to hear religion in a rational and reasonable way. You know, it's interesting. If we can't give people a logical, rational, reasonable explanation of our religion and our relationship with God, what does it tell us about our own foundation? What does it tell us about our own beliefs? When Paul approached the church or the people of Athens, he did so with logic, but also with love. Number two, if we want to teach in today's environment, we need to start where they are, where those people are, whoever they happen to be. As Paul began his lesson, he acknowledged them for what they had. You go back and you look at the beginning of his sermon, and he says, I can tell that you are very religious. The guys that read earlier, they read the word Areopagus. It would have been easier to read Mars Hill. That's what it was. It was a place of idols that was named after not the planet, but the god. Here they were in a place that was so filled with religion that it had a religious name. He was on Mars Hill. They believed in gods. They were idol worshippers, but they were religious people. So what did Paul do? He didn't walk over to the god of Zeus and kick it over and say, you don't want to believe in him. He didn't go over where Athena was and, throw his tunic over that idol and say, don't pay attention to her. What he did was he walked up and he found one that had an inscription to an unknown god, and he said, let me tell you about this God. This one that you don't know about. This one who created the heavens and the earth. We need to start where people are. I think sometimes when we begin teaching, the first thing that we need to do is we need to know where they are religiously. I wonder sometimes if we are afraid to ask people about their religion. A lot of times when we sit down with somebody, what we want to do is we want to open up the book and we've got our spiel right there, and that's what we want to give them. Maybe there's a better way of doing that. Maybe the thing to do is sit down and say, hey, tell me your story. Tell me your religious story. Because if they believe in God and they believe in Jesus and they believe that they need to do something, they need to be reborn to be saved, we know where to start. But if they believe in God, but they believe that Jesus didn't exist, we know where to start. Are we willing to let them tell their story? The best place to start teaching is to begin listening. We need to know where they are, first of all, in their religious walk. But secondly, we need to build upon what we agree upon, not alienate them by spotlighting the difference. It is so easy when somebody starts to talk about their religion to go, whoa, wait a minute, hold on here, hold the bus. That's not the way things are, let me tell you. Now I'm going to tell you, if you come to my house and you do that to me, you won't be at my house very long. Why in the world would we expect others to be welcoming in that way? Why not do this? Why not accept what we agree on and then start building on those differences? One of my favorite stories comes from Acts chapter 18. Just turn the page over in most of your Bibles, or if you have the electronic version, just scroll down a little bit. One of my favorite stories is about a couple by the name of Aquila and Priscilla. They go to a church. They are listening to a guy by the name of Apollos, and he is preaching up a storm. But he leaves one thing out. Apollos was a man of God. He understood spiritual living. He understood Jesus. He could preach Christianity. But one thing he didn't have was he didn't know that there was another baptism. He just preached the baptism of John. And so what did Aquila and Priscilla do? Did they get up in the middle of a sermon and go, wait, you forgot something here, bud? And what they did was they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. How would our ministry change? How would our evangelism change if we took this approach? That we, as we visited with someone, we weren't trying to change them. We were trying to explain the way of God more accurately. Most religious people have a belief, have a sincere belief, and they want to do what's right when it comes to pleasing God. We got one of two options. We can either treat them like infidels and alienate them, or we can take care and take care of them and build upon what they know and say, hey, have you ever thought about this? What if you add this to where you are in your religion, to your belief system? You know what? I agree with you to this point. You ever thought about this? Wouldn't this make you even closer to God? Now, is the teaching the same? The principles are pretty much the same, aren't they? What about the Spirit? Again, if you come to me and you say, you got it wrong, I'm going to shut down. But if you come to me and you say, you know what, I like the way you think, going to take it up a notch? What about this? How about this? Don't you think this would bring you closer to God? Again, the context, or I should say the text, the doctrine is the same. It's the attitude that's the difference. To teach in today's world, we need to start where they are and build positively on that. Third thing, and I'm going to apologize before I get to this next slide because I may offend some of you. To teach in today's world, we need to accept our own weirdness. All right. I don't like being called weird. Well, hang in there with me. Paul had to have known that what he was about to teach was going to be perceived as being odd. I want you to think about this here for just a second. He is standing in the midst of Greek mythology. Just about everybody here, if you went through the public school system, you got a dose of mythology. Whether it was the Greek or the Roman gods, you knew about Zeus and you knew about all of these other things and how he lived up here on this place. And I mean, that's what they believed. That's what they worshipped as part of their religion. Their established religion of the day was a polytheistic world. Their gods were their war heroes. They lived in Mount Olympus. They were distant from everything. As Paul stood up there in front of them, he was about to teach them a new religion. One God who came to earth as a poor human, who lived among mankind, who was crucified on the cross as a criminal, and who was raised to save all men even though he had no physical form. Wow, that's different. Paul had to accept the fact that what he was teaching was going to be foreign to them. But he also had to be confident in his message. When we go out and when we teach in today's world, we have to understand this. We need to realize that when we take our message out to the world, we're going to be perceived as being odd. Maybe I should have used the word oddity rather than weirdness. But frankly, there's some people that are going to look at us and they're going to go, folks, you're weird. I mean, think about this for just a second. Today's world, today's religious world is filled with icons of religion. Okay, we got a couple of banners here, but I don't see a crucifix anywhere. I don't see statues. And come to think of it, I don't see a piano. You guys really sure you're Christians? Calvin's off in Montana. This is one of the holiest weeks of the year to many religions. Why am I here and he's not? That's all right, because as soon as we're done here, you guys can go out and you can go on and live your own life, and you can put your religion, back in your coat pocket and wait till next Sunday to bring it out. When we look at today's religion, it is much different than what we're going to try to be presenting to people. Our religion, which is relatively bland in a worship environment, physically and also emotionally. We don't have a big band striking up and, I'm not up here filled with the Spirit, speaking in tongues and saying all of these things that are trying to get you emotionally fired up. We use a cappella music. We have adult believer baptism. And folks, if you don't think that's odd in today's world, that's pretty different. Christianity being the core element of our lives rather than something that is just we take out and play with on Sunday and we put it back in on Monday. Sometimes our approach to religion is different. It's odd. And we have to accept that. Now, we cannot be soft on our principles. We have to believe the core scriptures and the doctrines and the teachings of the New Testament. But we also have to realize that what we are teaching is not the norm in today's society. And it's not the norm in Christianity. So what do? Are we at a stalemate? Do we just hold up ourselves in our own little buildings and do our own little thing? What we need to do, first of all, is we need to take the time to be willing to explain why we think what we think is important. We need to be able to explain the principles we believe and why we are convinced by Scripture that we do it the way we do it. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Peter, as he's kind of finishing up this letter, he says, you need to be able to make a defense that is of the hope that is in you, but to do so with gentleness and reverence. Can we explain what we're doing? Can we explain what we believe, and can we explain it in a non-threatening way? That's what 1 Peter 3:15 talks about. We need to be willing to take the time to explain why we believe and why it is important. And secondly, we need to give people a little bit of time to accept something new. Mentioned this morning, I've been doing this church thing for at least 30 years. Somebody walks up to me and says, you need to change the way you're doing it. I've been doing it this way for a half a century. Boy, that makes me sound old, doesn't it? I've been doing it this way for a half a century, and you want me to change right now? Huh, I'm not sure about that. If we're going to go out and we're going to teach in today's world, we have to give people a chance to embrace the ideas that we're talking about. Can we be willing, or can we effectively teach what we need to be teaching? And do we have the patience to let people to catch up to us? We need to teach in today's world, or as we teach in today's world, we need to accept the fact that the rest of the religious world doesn't think the way that we do. How can we convince them? Teaching Christ effectively in today's world begins by loving your audience, or I should say by knowing your audience. We got to know what people need to hear. But at the heart of this is we got to care about our audience. Do we care enough about the world that when we look out and we see what's going on in religion, and we see what's going on today in our communities and in our nation, that we care enough to try to make a difference in their lives? As Paul looked at the city of Athens, he was touched. He wanted to make a difference. When we look at faith, when we look at South Dakota, when we look at the U.S., and when we look at the world, do we want to make a difference? Interestingly, the only way that we can do that is if we truly believe that God has made a difference in our lives. As we get to the end of every lesson, one of the things that we want to do is give anybody a chance who needs a chance to make things right with God to do so. In just a minute, we're going to have a final song. And as we go through that song, if there is anything that you need to do in your life to get right with God, we're going to give you the opportunity to do so. If you need to make a change, we ask you to come while we stand and sing.